Hi everyone, this is Morgan, and in this video I'm going to talk more about the fourth process journal for the character collage, aka rough renderings. I'm going to show you some demo rough renderings that I made for this project, still following the narrative of the piano and the character of Ada that I picked in previous videos. While this process isn't quite as linear as past projects, I still wanted to show you different methods and different directions that you could take these rough renderings in. Rough renderings for our purposes just is basically the visual equivalent of a rough draft. And don't freak out, you only need 2 rough renderings. I just wanted to show you 3 examples and 3 different methods of tackling this. As a reminder, each rough rendering must be 7 inches by 10 inches. That's so it can be about half scale in terms of what your final piece will be. You also must only use images that reference your narrative or character in some way. That can be a loose interpretation, but it needs to be able to be related back. And you need to use at least 2 methods that create the illusion of space. So we've talked about those in previous videos. They include overlapping, diminishing size, placement, using shifting value and color, shifting detail, and linear perspective. Another thing to consider for the rough renderings is that while your final will need to utilize 3 or more media, you can just stick to your comfort zone. And we're going to talk a lot more about that, but basically you don't have to use 3 or more media in your rough renderings. If you find it easiest to sketch, you can do only sketching for your rough rendering. If you like working in Photoshop, just use Photoshop. Basically, I want you to think about what is your easiest sketching method. What do you think will be the fastest, most efficient, and just best way to brainstorm your ideas visually? So again, I'm showing you example images I've done for this project. This is my first piece. As someone who works in Photoshop, I found it easiest to sketch in Photoshop, so that's why I picked that method. Because of that, I was able to use my images from my image bank not only as reference images, but instead here as source images. I'm literally plugging objects that you've seen before in past videos and just putting them directly into my composition. So a few things I want to acknowledge. It's a little rough. I mean, these are allowed to be kind of rough, sketchy renderings. I haven't made this a perfect, seamless collage in Photoshop. That's fine. That's not the purpose of these. You just want to get them to a good enough place where you can plan out your final. So I'll talk a little bit more about the choices I made in each composition and why I think some work better than others. I tried to do a screen recording of myself making some of these, and it didn't really work out because I think when the collaging process or the planning process for a collage is going well, it involves a lot of tinkering, of trying out one idea and not liking it and kind of revisiting it in a different form. There should be some element of playfulness in building these. So you can see I ended up cutting kind of a triangular shape out of her head so that she doesn't have eyes and they're just these floating circles emanating out. That was to kind of solve a visual problem of having a lot of dead negative space in the top part of my composition. So I just figured it's a collage. I'm allowed to just have these floating circles with these strange elements contained in them, because that's kind of what collage excels at. It excels at just not having to follow a clear logic. So that's one thing I explored a lot in this piece. In terms of thinking about how it meets the requirements, you should be able to see there's this kind of transparent bonnet that I put over her in the foreground. You see it floating above that mountainous form in the middle ground, and it's actually small in the high right corner. So we do have the illusion of space created through that process. We also have the illusion of space just created through the landscape. We have linear perspective shown through the photographic landscape behind the figure. So you don't need to think about constantly creating the illusion of space. 1 or 2 elements normally does it on its own. So other elements of this collage, I obviously beheaded my figure. I put her on this cage crinoline body. The hand coming out of the center is from the end of the movie when she has a metal finger. I threw the piano in there over another circle just because that had been a continuing element. And I decided to implement these vines just growing out from the bottom. So a lot of those were individually created, again, to solve visual problems. I beheaded my figure. What am I going to put as her body? It doesn't need to be a literal body. I need a little bit of color at the base. I can add these vines. I need maybe more of a direct reference to the piano. I'll just add it as this floating circle. I ended up feeling like this piece might be a little bit too busy. I felt like the color scheme might be a little intense, but I did still feel like good visual problem solving had happened. So moving forward, with the next piece I created, I liked a lot of the elements from this one. I liked showing the braids. I felt like in terms of if I wanted to make the face a drawn element, drawing the braids would be a really good visual cue. But I did want a slightly more simplistic composition. So this next one, I think, is a little bit more simplistic. I picked a different image of the same beach, just because that beach is really important. I have the figure repeated facing away from us 3 times. That's actually called a Rücken figure. But at a diminishing size, so that begins to create the illusion of space. The landscape does as well. I also felt like I wanted to add these images of fish. They're a part of the final shot of the movie. I found a 19th century illustration, which I thought matched the aesthetic of the movie pretty well. So I included those repeated many times throughout the background and also in the foreground, where obviously they're not a logical addition, but it's a collage, so who cares? I decided just to add to it. You can see some fish are holding up little parasols, which is again another object I already had. I also have the finger kind of emerging out of the cliff on the beach. So in the final piece, a few additions that I made might need to appear in slightly different forms. I have this kind of long rope that's a key part of the final scene. In the final piece, I would have it start out as kind of an extension of her braid up until about the middle ground where it becomes more of a clear rope. And the colors would probably shift. I would want the finger to blend in with the cliff a little bit better. But this still is a good rough rendering. It gives me a good sense of where the final composition could go. For my final rough rendering, and again, if you're doing this assignment in spring of 2020, you do not have to do a third rough rendering, but I just wanted to show you examples. I wanted to give a even more minimal version of this piece. So I took an image of the main character and I kind of imagined I was cutting off the top chunk of her head, but I tried to mimic just using an oval form in Photoshop, the idea that we're cutting open her head to see something unexpected inside. So the interior space is instead filled with an ocean, and we see fish emerging from it into a more real sense of space with the landscape. So the fish give us a few things. One, they add an element, obviously a connection between this large figure and the landscape behind. Also, they create the illusion of space through having diminishing size and actually diminishing value and color as well. So once I created this central figure, I also used a filter in Photoshop to make this look like a photocopy. That just gives me a better sense of what this piece will look like when I translate it to a pretty simple contour drawing in my final, if I were to pick this one. I also repeated the oval forms a few times in different values just to create more of a connection and more activity in the sky. And in that middle oval, I do have, again, the severed finger just kind of lightly poking out. So those are the 3 kind of methods I wanted to show you. Obviously, I'm using Photoshop, but I think you could approximate any of these approaches with sketching or painting or whatever brainstorming method works for you. In a future video, I'll talk a lot more about planning your character collage final project and making the transition between your rough rendering and that final stage of the process. In a lot of these, I haven't even made a final choice about which media would be used for which elements. So that's all for this video. Thanks, everyone.